The hammer is a simple tool made of steel and wood. But there's nothing simple about the way it got to you. That hammer's been blasted, crushed, beaten, burned, melted, and molded. It's crossed 2 oceans. It's been transported thousands of miles. It's spent 30 years growing on a mountainside. Thousands of people had something to do with it. Where did it come from? How did it get here? Your hammer has a story that begins with the creation of the universe and takes us on a trip around the world that ends in your toolbox. Around 14 billion years ago, the Big Bang exploded and atoms were created. Things crashed into each other and made other things. Gravity grabbed material into growing lumps. Stars were born and the Earth was formed. Everything that made up the Earth came from the stars, and as the Earth cooled, star stuff cooled and solidified. A large deposit of iron ore congealed on what is now the west coast of Australia. The earthly journey of your hammer begins at the Purdu mine. Iron ore is blasted from the ground into a pile of rubble. An excavator scoops it up and dumps it into the world's largest dump truck. The truck moves it to a dump site near a railroad track. A giant excavator loads the ore into ore hoppers on a train. The train travels 400 miles from Purdu to Port Hedland. The trains move on an elevated track next to the transport ship. The ore is dumped from the bottom of the hoppers through chutes and into the hold of the ship. The ship travels 4,119 miles through pirate-infested waters in the Strait of Malacca off the coast of Indonesia to Tianjin, China. While the ore transport smashes through the waves in the Pacific, cedar trees have been growing on a mountainside in Bitterroot, Oregon for 30 years. Lumberjacks cut them down, load them onto a truck, drive them to Portland, to a railway site where they're loaded onto a train. The timber travels 2,794 miles from Portland onto the S&P Railroad to the Pacific Railroad to the eastern, through Sacramento, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Tucson, El Paso, winding along the nation's rail network, through Dallas, and to a lumber yard outside of Atlanta. Lumber cranes unload the logs and stack them. A crane loads the logs onto a truck that delivers a load to the Whitley Monahan Tool Handle Company in Midland, North Carolina. The logs are unloaded into their lumber yard, then taken to their mill where the handles are made. Back in China, the iron ore ship arrives at the docks in Tianjin. The ore is unloaded by scoops onto a conveyor belt into another train. The train travels 10 miles to the Huajiang steel mill outside of Tianjin. The train moves up another elevated track and dumps the ore into a giant pit reservoir. The main ingredient of a steel hammer is ready to be smelted. But there's more to a hammer than iron. An iron hammer would shatter without other metal alloys that are mixed into the molten recipe. Manganese, nickel, chromium, and vanadium have to be added in just the right amounts to create a high tensile strength steel. At the Kuraman manganese mine in South Africa, diggers at the face of the seam scrape manganese ore to a conveyor belt that goes directly to the surface of the mine and is dumped in a huge pile. The ore is scooped into train hoppers and delivered to the port of Durban, where the train dumps the ore into a transport ship and makes its way to Tianjin. Up next, thousands of miles to go to bring manganese, nickel, chromite, vanadium, and iron together in a crucible of fire.